I know it's got to rattle the community, and especially it being a private Christian school.
Bonnie Brown, a former teacher and student at Nathaniel Green Academy, even crowned homecoming queen in 2016, now accused of having sex with one of her students.
Before we understand what happened, we need to understand where it happened. Nathaniel Green Academy sits in Salome, Georgia, a tiny community in Greene County, roughly 80 miles east of Atlanta. The school operates out of a red brick building constructed in 1929, a structure so historic it earned a spot on the National Register of Historic Places in 2002. The academy was founded in 1969, during one of the most turbulent periods in American education. While the school's official website describes it as a traditional college preparatory school, the truth is more complicated. Historical records reveal that Nathaniel Green Academy opened as what's known as a segregation academy, schools that emerged across the South in response to court-ordered desegregation. The founding date tells the story. 1969. Just 1 year after the Supreme Court finally enforced Brown v. Board of Education with real consequences. Across Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and Louisiana, private schools with similar founding dates popped up like mushrooms after rain. Samuel Albert Academy opened in 1971. George Walton Academy in 1969. Thomas Jefferson Academy formed from the merger of two schools, both founded in 1970. In its first year of operation, Nathaniel Green Academy had 0 black students or teachers. The school purchased its original 5-acre campus from the town of Salome for $100. That same property was later valued at $24,000 for tax purposes. Now, more than 50 years later, the school has evolved. According to recent data, the academy enrolls approximately 72 students from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. The student-to-teacher ratio stands at 3.8 to 1, remarkably low. The school operates 170 days per year with 7.4-hour school days. But here's what stands out. In 2018, the student body included only 3 black students. No Asian students. No Hispanic students. This in a county where approximately 40% of the population is black. The school markets itself as a Christian institution, promising to unify students from a broad diversity of religious backgrounds within a consistent environment of Christian education, love, and values. Parents pay tuition for what they believe is a safe, faith-based education for their children. The campus itself feels frozen in time. The original 1929 building still stands with its tin ceilings, wooden floors, and tongue-and-groove wainscoting. There's a performing arts auditorium with what locals describe as grand acoustics. The property includes the Rhodes football field, donated by a local family decades ago. For many families in Greene County, Nathaniel Green Academy represents tradition. Generations attend. Original founders' grandchildren walk the same halls their grandparents did in 1969. The school's motto emphasizes academic excellence, fine arts, and athletics within a well-rounded program. But in June 2024, this image of safety and tradition would begin to crumble. June 14, 2024. A Friday. The school year had just ended. Students were beginning their summer break, looking forward to months of freedom before returning in the fall. But on this particular Friday, the Greene County Sheriff's Office received information that would launch one of the most disturbing investigations in the county's recent history. A complaint came in. The details alleged sexual contact between a student and a teacher at Nathaniel Green Academy. Not a current complaint, but allegations about conduct that had occurred while both the victim and the accused were at the school. The sheriff's office immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't something they could handle alone. They needed specialists. They needed investigators trained in these exact types of cases. They called the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The GBI is Georgia's statewide investigative agency, equipped to handle complex cases that require extensive resources. When local law enforcement needs help with major crimes, the GBI steps in. Their involvement signals that this case was serious from the very beginning. The investigation began quietly. In small communities like Salome, rumors spread like wildfire. The investigators needed to work carefully, gathering evidence without tipping off potential suspects or compromising the integrity of their case. The focus of their initial investigation was Bonnie Elizabeth Brown, 25 years old, a teacher. But not just any teacher at Nathaniel Green Academy. Brown herself was an alumna of the school. She had walked those same hallways as a student. She had been crowned homecoming queen in 2016, just 9 years earlier. This detail makes the allegations even more disturbing. Brown knew the school from the inside. She understood its culture, its rhythms, its blind spots. She had been part of the NGA family her entire life. But by June 2024, Brown no longer taught at Nathaniel Green Academy. She had moved on to another position in neighboring Wilkes County, where she worked at Washington Wilkes County Primary School, teaching younger children. The investigators had to move carefully. They needed to interview witnesses. They needed to gather physical evidence if any existed. They needed to build a timeline of events. Most importantly, they needed to speak with the victim. Attorney Ashley Mitchell would later reveal crucial details about the case. The victim was male. He had been a direct student of not one, but two female teachers who would eventually face charges. The contact didn't just happen once or in one location. Physical contact occurred both on school property and off campus, at locations outside the school's walls. This pattern of behavior suggested something calculated, something planned. Not a single lapse in judgment, but an ongoing situation that played out over time. As summer turned into fall, the investigation continued. Months passed. The 2024 to 2025 school year began. Students returned to Nathaniel Green Academy, unaware that investigators were quietly building a case that would eventually rock their small community. During these months, Brown continued teaching in Wilkes County. Parents dropped their young children off at the primary school, trusting her with their most precious possessions. The school administration there had no idea about the investigation happening in the next county. Meanwhile, investigators were uncovering something even more troubling. The evidence suggested that Brown might not have acted alone. There were indications that another teacher at Nathaniel Green Academy had also been involved with the same victim. The scope of the investigation was expanding. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. One that raised serious questions about what school administrators knew and when they knew it. Attorney Ashley Mitchell, representing the victim, made a statement that should alarm anyone who cares about child safety. My understanding is that one of the individual teachers that was recently arrested, she had actually been written up for inappropriate conduct with the student and this victim. Read that again. Written up for inappropriate conduct with this specific victim. This revelation changes everything. It means that at some point before law enforcement ever got involved, someone at Nathaniel Green Academy observed behavior concerning enough to document it officially. Someone put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard and created a written record of inappropriate conduct between a teacher and a student. And then what happened? Nothing that we know of. The teacher apparently continued working. The conduct apparently continued. And law enforcement wasn't notified. Georgia law is crystal clear on this point. Teachers are mandated reporters. This legal requirement doesn't come with exceptions. It doesn't matter if you teach at a public school, a charter school, or a private Christian academy. The law applies equally. If you have reasonable suspicion that sexual contact or abuse has occurred involving a minor, you have a legal obligation to report it immediately to the authorities. Not to your principal. Not to your board of trustees. To law enforcement. The penalty for failing to report can include criminal charges against the person who failed to report. These laws exist for a reason. They create a safety net designed to catch abuse before it escalates. They prevent institutions from sweeping problems under the rug to protect their reputation. But in this case, according to the victim's attorney, it doesn't seem that the information made its way to law enforcement from administration. Think about what this means. A teacher exhibits inappropriate conduct with a student. Someone notices. Someone documents it. But 9 months pass before the Greene County Sheriff's Office learns about it, and that information apparently doesn't come from the school administration. Who reported it then? The timeline suggests it might have been the victim himself or his family. We don't know for certain because those details remain protected. But we know the school didn't make the call in June 2024 when investigators first got involved. This failure represents a betrayal of trust on multiple levels. Parents send their children to private Christian schools believing they're choosing a safer environment. They pay tuition specifically for the promise of more attention, smaller class sizes, and better oversight. The marketing materials for Nathaniel Green Academy emphasize safety. They talk about providing a very safe and secure learning environment. They promise excellent opportunities for students in academics, athletics, and additional extracurricular activities. But what good are small class sizes if teachers abuse the access those environments provide? What value is there in Christian education if the adults fail to protect the vulnerable? The school's response to the arrests raises even more questions. On Monday, March 24, 2025, after both teachers had been arrested, Nathaniel Green Academy released a statement. The statement was carefully worded, clearly written with legal advice. The Board of Trustees said they were conducting their own investigation to determine any and all appropriate measures which need to be taken by the school. They emphasized being careful not to interfere with law enforcement's investigation. But perhaps the most revealing line in their statement was this. The school claimed they didn't receive any complaints from students or parents while the women were employed there. This claim is technically possible while still being misleading. If the inappropriate conduct was written up by another staff member rather than reported by a parent, the school could make this statement while knowing about documented problems. It's a careful dance of legal language. Saying we received no complaints from parents or students is different from saying we had no knowledge of any inappropriate conduct. The first statement can be true while the second is false. 9 months after the investigation began, law enforcement finally had enough evidence to move forward. March 21, 2025. A Friday morning. Officers arrived at an address in Wilkes County. Bonnie Elizabeth Brown was taken into custody without incident. She was transported to the Greene County Sheriff's Office jail, where she was formally booked and processed. The charges against Brown were serious but relatively narrow compared to what was coming. Improper sexual contact by an employee, agent, or foster parent. This charge carries significant penalties under Georgia law, but it was just the beginning. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation released a statement that same day. They confirmed that their investigation, which began in June 2024, had determined that Brown engaged in sexual contact with a student while employed as a teacher at Nathaniel Green Academy. The news hit the community like a bomb. Brown wasn't just some teacher. She was one of them. An alumna. Someone who had been celebrated at the school, crowned homecoming queen less than a decade earlier. Parents who had children in her classes were horrified. How long had this been going on? Had anyone suspected? Why hadn't anyone stopped it sooner? But the shock wasn't over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. The Wilkes County school system quickly released their own statement. They confirmed that Brown had been employed at Washington Wilkes County Primary School but was no longer on staff as of March 24. They emphasized their commitment to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation and assured parents that the circumstances leading to these charges occurred prior to her employment with Wilkes County School. This clarification mattered. Parents needed to know their children at the primary school had not been victimized. The conduct happened earlier at a different school with a different victim. But behind the scenes, investigators were still working. Because the evidence they had gathered suggested something even more disturbing. Brown hadn't acted alone. Over that weekend, detectives reviewed their evidence. They conducted additional interviews. They prepared another arrest warrant. And on Monday, March 24, just 3 days after Brown's arrest, they made their move. Sherry Dell Maldon was 60 years old. She had spent decades in education. She had been teaching for longer than some of her colleagues had been alive. And now she too was being arrested. But the charges against Maldon were far more severe than those against Brown. Maldon faced 3 separate charges: improper sexual contact by an employee, agent, or foster parent, aggravated child molestation, statutory rape. These charges painted a picture of conduct far more serious than Brown's. Under Georgia law, aggravated child molestation is one of the most serious felonies in the criminal code. Conviction carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It's the kind of charge that can effectively end someone's life behind bars. The arrests, coming just 3 days apart, sent a clear message. This wasn't a case of one teacher making a terrible mistake. This was something more organized, more calculated, and potentially more widespread. Attorney Ashley Mitchell, representing the victim, made a statement that should concern everyone. There is information to suggest that potentially other teachers may have been involved with other victims. Other teachers. Other victims. The possibility that what investigators had uncovered so far might be just the tip of the iceberg. While we must protect the identity of the victim, understanding the scope of what happened to him is crucial to grasping the magnitude of this case. The victim was a male student at Nathaniel Green Academy. He was a direct student of both Bonnie Brown and Sherry Maldon. This means he sat in their classrooms. He completed their assignments. He looked to them for guidance, education, and support. These weren't random adults he encountered on the street. They were teachers, authority figures, women he was taught to respect and obey, women his parents trusted with his education and safety. The sexual contact occurred in multiple locations. Some incidents happened on school grounds. At Nathaniel Green Academy itself, in the very building where parents dropped him off each morning, believing he was safe. The abuse happened in the hallways, classrooms, or other areas of the campus where these teachers had access and privacy. But the contact also extended beyond the school. Off-campus locations were involved. This suggests planning and premeditation. It means these teachers found ways to get the victim alone outside of school hours, away from the eyes of other staff members or students. This pattern of behavior is common in predator cases. Abusers groom their victims over time. They build trust. They create situations where they can be alone with their target. They test boundaries gradually, seeing what they can get away with before escalating. The psychological damage from this kind of abuse can be profound and lasting. When authority figures betray trust in this way, it fundamentally alters how victims view the world. It damages their ability to trust teachers, mentors, and other authority figures. It can impact their relationships, their education, their mental health, and their entire future. For a male victim abused by female teachers, there are additional layers of trauma. Society often dismisses or minimizes abuse when the perpetrator is female and the victim is male. People make jokes. They suggest the victim was lucky or should have enjoyed the attention. This response compounds the trauma and makes it harder for male victims to come forward. The victim in this case showed enormous courage by reporting what happened to him. Coming forward about sexual abuse is never easy. For a young male student accusing female teachers in a small, tight-knit community, it would have been particularly difficult. He likely faced skepticism. He might have worried about being blamed or not believed. He may have feared retaliation or social consequences. But he told someone what happened. And that disclosure eventually led to the investigation that resulted in these arrests. Attorney Ashley Mitchell has been working to ensure the victim's voice is heard through the legal process. In interviews, Mitchell has emphasized that this case represents a serious betrayal of trust by educators who were supposed to protect their student, not exploit him. The law recognizes that students cannot consent to sexual contact with their teachers. The power imbalance is too great. Teachers hold authority over students' grades, their recommendations, their academic future. That power dynamic makes genuine consent impossible, which is why these relationships are illegal regardless of the student's age or apparent willingness. In Georgia, when a person in a position of authority, such as a teacher, engages in sexual contact with a student, it's automatically considered a crime. The law presumes that the student cannot freely consent because of the power imbalance inherent in the relationship. This victim's case represents everything these laws are designed to prevent. And yet, despite all the safeguards supposedly in place, despite the laws requiring mandatory reporting, despite the small class sizes and close community, the abuse allegedly continued for an extended period. The question that haunts this case is simple but profound. How many people knew or suspected something was wrong before anyone took action to protect this young person? As of October 2025, the investigation remains active and ongoing. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation has made it clear that they're not done looking into what happened at Nathaniel Green Academy. The agency has issued public appeals for information. They've asked anyone with knowledge about the case to contact either the Greene County Sheriff's Office or the GBI's Regional Investigative Office in Milledgeville. These appeals suggest investigators believe there may be additional witnesses or victims who haven't yet come forward. Remember Attorney Mitchell's statement? There is information to suggest that potentially other teachers may have been involved with other victims. This isn't speculation. This is a statement from an attorney who has access to evidence and has been briefed by law enforcement. What does that mean? It could mean investigators have found evidence of other inappropriate relationships at the school. It could mean they've identified potential additional victims who haven't yet agreed to press charges or participate in the investigation. It could mean they're looking at other teachers who may have known about the abuse and failed to report it. The scope of the investigation appears to be expanding rather than contracting. This is often a sign that investigators are uncovering more problems as they dig deeper into an institution's culture and practices. In cases like this, the first arrests are rarely the last. Once victims see that law enforcement is taking allegations seriously, others who have remained silent often find the courage to come forward. Once investigators start examining an institution's records and interviewing staff, they frequently discover evidence of additional misconduct that wasn't part of the initial complaint. The charges against the two teachers also suggest different levels of involvement and different types of conduct. Brown faces a single charge of improper sexual contact. Maldon faces that same charge plus aggravated child molestation and statutory rape. This disparity suggests that prosecutors believe Maldon's conduct was more serious, more frequent, or involved more severe acts than Brown's. Both women have been banned from Nathaniel Green Academy property. The school's board of trustees made this clear in their public statement. This ban is telling. It suggests the school now recognizes these individuals pose a danger, even if they failed to act on that recognition earlier. Both defendants were booked into the Greene County Sheriff's Office jail. Their cases will eventually be turned over to the Okmulgee Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office for prosecution. This means a grand jury will review the evidence and decide whether to indict both women on the charges filed against them. If indicted, both will face trial unless they reach plea agreements with prosecutors. Given the severity of the charges, particularly those against Maldon, we can expect these cases to move slowly through the legal system. Defense attorneys will need time to review evidence. There may be motions to suppress evidence or dismiss charges. The victim may need to testify, which could be traumatic and could affect the timeline. For the community of Siloam and the families connected to Nathaniel Green Academy, this waiting period is agonizing. Parents want answers. They want to know if their children were safe. They want to understand how this happened. They want assurance that the school is doing everything possible to prevent it from happening again. But those answers may be slow in coming. Criminal investigations don't move according to the community's timeline. They move according to the evidence and the legal process. The Nathaniel Green Academy case isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a disturbing national trend of teacher sexual misconduct cases that have come to light in recent years. According to federal education data, reports of sexual misconduct by school employees have increased significantly over the past decade. This doesn't necessarily mean abuse is becoming more common. It may simply mean that victims are feeling more empowered to come forward and that institutions are facing more pressure to report misconduct rather than handle it internally. The #MeToo movement, which gained momentum in 2017, created space for victims of sexual abuse to speak out. While much of the public focus was on harassment and assault in Hollywood and corporate America, the movement also impacted how we discuss abuse in educational settings. Private schools face particular challenges when it comes to accountability. Unlike public schools, which are subject to extensive state oversight and public records laws, private schools operate with considerably more autonomy. They set their own policies. They conduct their own investigations. They decide what to report and what to handle internally. This autonomy can be beneficial when it allows schools to create innovative programs and maintain high standards. But it can be dangerous when it allows schools to hide problems to protect their reputation. Christian schools, specifically, sometimes face additional pressure to handle problems within the family rather than involving secular authorities. There can be a culture of protecting the institution's reputation as a place of moral authority. Admitting that abuse happened can feel like admitting failure of the Christian mission itself. None of this excuses what happened at Nathaniel Green Academy. But it helps explain how an institution could fail so completely to protect a vulnerable student. The mandatory reporter laws exist specifically to prevent this kind of institutional cover-up. By making individual teachers and staff members personally responsible for reporting suspected abuse, the law creates multiple potential points where someone should intervene. Even if administrators want to keep things quiet, individual teachers are supposed to make the call to authorities. But mandatory reporter laws only work if people understand them and follow them. In many states, including Georgia, training on mandatory reporting requirements is inconsistent. Teachers at private schools may receive less training than their public school counterparts. They may not fully understand their legal obligations. Or worse, they may understand them but face pressure from administrators not to report. The failure in this case appears to be institutional. Multiple adults at Nathaniel Green Academy likely knew or suspected something inappropriate was happening. Someone cared enough to write up one of the teachers for inappropriate conduct. But that knowledge apparently never translated into the required call to law enforcement. This represents a system's failure. Not just one person making a bad decision, but an entire institution failing to prioritize student safety over reputation management. The arrest of 2 teachers at Nathaniel Green Academy sent shockwaves through Greene County. This is a small, close-knit community where everyone knows everyone. The school serves multiple generations of families. Students who graduated decades ago send their own children and grandchildren there. For many in the community, the arrests felt personal. These weren't strangers accused of terrible crimes. These were women they knew. Bonnie Brown had been a student there. People remembered watching her crowned homecoming queen. Sherry Maldon had taught for years, touching countless students' lives. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the person described in the criminal charges? How do you process that someone you trusted with your child could be capable of such betrayal? Parents whose children attended classes taught by Brown or Maldon faced particularly difficult conversations. They had to talk to their kids about what happened. They had to ask if anything inappropriate had ever occurred with their child. They had to watch for signs of trauma while trying not to project fear onto children who may have had perfectly normal classroom experiences. For alumni of Nathaniel Green Academy, the news was devastating in a different way. Your school is part of your identity. It's where you learned and grew. It's connected to your fondest memories of childhood and adolescence. Having that institution tainted by scandal creates a sense of loss and betrayal. Some members of the community rallied around the school, insisting that these were isolated incidents that don't reflect on the institution as a whole. They pointed to the school's decades of service. They talked about all the good teachers who have worked there over the years. They argued that you can't judge an entire school by the actions of two individuals. Others demanded accountability. They wanted to know what the administration knew and when they knew it. They wanted explanations for why the alleged abuse continued for so long. They wanted policy changes to ensure nothing like this could happen again. This division is common in communities facing institutional abuse scandals. People naturally want to defend places and institutions they love. They want to believe the problem is limited to a few bad actors rather than indicative of deeper cultural or systemic issues. But defending the institution shouldn't come at the expense of the victim. And protecting the school's reputation shouldn't prevent honest examination of how these crimes were allowed to occur and continue. Local news coverage of the arrests was extensive. Reporters from Atlanta stations made the drive to Greene County to cover the story. The case received attention from news outlets across Georgia and eventually garnered national coverage. The attention brought unwanted scrutiny to a community that values privacy. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk about Nathaniel Green Academy. Reporters dug into the school's history. They asked difficult questions about oversight and accountability at private religious schools. They pressed administrators for answers about what they knew and when. The school's response to media inquiries was minimal. After the initial statement from the Board of Trustees, administrators went largely silent. This silence is legally prudent. Anything they say publicly could affect the criminal case or expose the school to civil liability. But the silence also feeds speculation and rumors. In small communities, when official channels won't provide information, unofficial channels fill the void. Rumors spread through church parking lots and grocery store aisles. People share theories on social media. Some of these rumors contain truth. Others are wildly speculative. The lack of official information makes it impossible for community members to separate fact from fiction. This information vacuum creates additional trauma for everyone involved, including the victim. Imagine being a young person who had the courage to report abuse, only to have your entire community discussing your case, speculating about details and debating whether to believe you. Both Bonnie Brown and Sherry Maldon face serious legal consequences if convicted of the charges against them. For Brown, the single charge of improper sexual contact by an employee, agent, or foster parent is a felony under Georgia law. Conviction could result in prison time, substantial fines, and mandatory registration as a sex offender. She would lose her teaching license permanently. She would face lifelong consequences that would affect her ability to work, where she can live, and how she's perceived by society. For Maldon, the stakes are exponentially higher. The aggravated child molestation charge alone carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years in prison without possibility of parole. Georgia law is unforgiving on this charge. Even if a judge wanted to show leniency, they couldn't. The mandatory minimum is just that, mandatory. Add the statutory rape charge and the improper sexual contact charge, and Maldon is potentially looking at spending the rest of her life in prison. At 60 years old, even a 25-year sentence would likely mean dying behind bars. These cases will proceed through several stages. First, both defendants will have initial appearances where they're formally informed of the charges and their rights. They'll have opportunities to retain private attorneys or have public defenders appointed if they can't afford private counsel. Next, the cases will go to a grand jury. In Georgia, prosecutors must present evidence to a grand jury for felony charges. The grand jury, made up of regular citizens, will hear a summary of the evidence and decide whether there's probable cause to believe the defendants committed the crimes they're charged with. If the grand jury returns indictments, the cases move to the trial phase. Both defendants will have the option to plead guilty as part of a plea agreement or proceed to trial. Given the severity of the charges against Maldon and the mandatory minimum sentence she faces, her attorney may advise going to trial unless prosecutors offer a significantly reduced charge. Brown might have more incentive to accept a plea deal. Her charges, while serious, don't carry the same mandatory minimums that Maldon faces. If prosecutors offer her a deal that avoids prison time in exchange for cooperation in the case against Maldon or other potential defendants, she might consider it. If either case goes to trial, the victim will almost certainly have to testify. This is often the most traumatic part of the legal process for victims of sexual abuse. They have to describe what happened to them in open court. They face cross-examination from defense attorneys whose job is to create reasonable doubt. They have to relive their trauma in front of strangers. The defense attorneys for both women will likely pursue several strategies. They may challenge the credibility of the victim. They may argue that any contact was consensual, though this defense has limits given the power dynamic between teachers and students. They may question the timeline of events or suggest the victim's memory is unreliable. They may also try to exclude evidence based on how it was collected. If investigators violated either defendant's rights during the investigation, any evidence obtained as a result could be suppressed. This is why law enforcement has to be meticulous in following proper procedures. The victim's attorney, Ashley Mitchell, will play a crucial role in protecting the victim's interests throughout this process. While prosecutors represent the state, and their focus is on securing convictions, Mitchell's sole focus is on what's best for the victim. She can advocate for him in ways the prosecutor might not. Beyond the criminal cases, there's also potential for civil litigation. The victim could file a lawsuit against Nathaniel Green Academy, its board of trustees, and potentially individual administrators. Such a lawsuit would allege that the school failed in its duty to protect him from abuse. Civil cases have a lower burden of proof than criminal cases. While prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in the criminal cases, the victim would only need to prove his civil claims by a preponderance of the evidence, essentially showing it's more likely than not that the school was negligent. A civil case could expose just how much the school knew about inappropriate conduct and when they knew it. Discovery in a civil case would give the victim's attorneys access to personnel files, internal communications, and other documents that might reveal what administrators knew about either teacher's behavior. The school likely carries liability insurance that would cover settlements or judgments in such a case. But no amount of money can truly compensate for the trauma of childhood sexual abuse. Civil litigation is about accountability as much as compensation. What can we learn from what happened at Nathaniel Green Academy? How can other schools, parents, and communities prevent similar tragedies? First, mandatory reporter training must be comprehensive, frequent, and taken seriously. Every adult who works in a school needs to understand that they are personally legally obligated to report suspected abuse. They need to know that they can't delegate this responsibility to a supervisor. They need to understand that protecting the institution's reputation is never more important than protecting a child. Private schools need better oversight. The autonomy that allows private schools to innovate and maintain high standards should not exempt them from basic safety requirements. States should require private schools to implement the same abuse prevention protocols required of public schools. Background checks are crucial, but they're not enough. Most people who commit sexual abuse of children have no prior criminal history. They're first-time offenders who took advantage of positions of trust. Schools need systems that monitor behavior and respond to warning signs before abuse occurs. These systems include clear policies about appropriate boundaries between teachers and students. Teachers should never be alone with a single student in an unsupervised location. Classroom doors should have windows. Schools should conduct regular climate surveys where students can report concerns anonymously. When someone does report inappropriate conduct, even if it seems minor, schools must take it seriously. They must investigate thoroughly. And if the concern involves potential sexual misconduct, they must immediately report to law enforcement. Internal investigations can continue alongside criminal investigations, but they cannot replace them. Parents also play a crucial role. You should talk to your children regularly about appropriate and inappropriate behavior by adults. Make sure they know that if any adult makes them uncomfortable, even a teacher or coach they're supposed to respect, they can tell you without getting in trouble. Watch for warning signs. Changes in behavior, declining grades, reluctance to go to school, or anxiety around particular teachers can all indicate problems. Trust your instincts. Something feels off, ask questions. Communities must be willing to prioritize child safety over institutional reputation. When abuse allegations surface, the first instinct should be protecting potential victims, not protecting the school. There will be time to assess reputational damage later. But you can't undo the harm of allowing abuse to continue while you worry about public relations. For Nathaniel Green Academy specifically, the path forward requires transparency and reform. The school's administration and board of trustees should commission and that's the latest on the shocking case rocking Nathaniel Green Academy. A story that reminds us how betrayal can sometimes come from the very people we're taught to trust the most. If you found this case as disturbing and eye-opening as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more real-life investigations just like this one. This is the Case File True Crime, where every story leaves a mark. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.